Hey everybody! The intro of this video is a lot different from my others because I'm not in my studio. I'm here in our backyard in the Pacific Northwest on the Oregon coast, and we are in the middle of record-breaking temperatures. We're in the middle of a heat wave, and I'm kind of miserable because we're not used to temperatures this high, but on days like this in the summer, I love getting creative with techniques that dry really quick in the sun and in the heat. It's something I like to do to take my mind off of stuff and kind of appreciate what we have going on instead of feeling miserable. So today I was going to take you through the process of creating, I guess, what I call watercolor nature printing. We're going to be using watercolor paper and watercolor paint and then things I pick from my backyard, just to share with you how you can create these really interesting surfaces pulled from nature, pulled from things you find in nature, but also make use of a warm, sunny day. So those of you out there this summer or wherever you're at with a hot day, this is a fun thing to do because your surface is going to dry really quickly. Other times of the year, you'd have to wait for things to dry overnight, maybe even over a couple of days. But on a day like today, I'm going to make use of the heat and create a bunch of these surfaces that I can use in my art journal and other art projects. And I'm going to take you along for the entire process. All right, so for this project, you're going to need watercolor paper. I really enjoy the Canson 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and any kind of watercolors are going to work. I've got the Art Philosophy set. I've got actually a couple of those sets that I really enjoy using, but basically any kind of watercolors are going to work for this process. And then you're going to need some kind of leaves or foliage gathered from nature. I actually really prefer ferns because we have a lot of those in our yard up here in the Pacific Northwest. I have found for this process, leaves and foliage that is a little bit thinner in nature works quite well. We are going to be placing them in our watercolors. So the thicker the leaves or the foliage, it gets a little bit tricky, but if you can find things that are thin, it actually works really, really well with this process and with sticking them into those watercolors. I actually gathered a whole bunch of dandelion leaves, which ended up being my favorite for this process. So depending on where you live, you probably have different things than I do, but I really enjoy gathering things from our yard, even weeds or clippings from our garden, and just seeing what I can come up with. So the way that you start is by just washing that page full of a lot of watercolor pigment or color, and enough that it's wet to have things stick or adhere to it. So I really get my brush quite loaded with water and color, and I go into that surface with as much paint as I can. Something I really enjoy doing, and I found that works well and is quite interesting, is going back over things, specifically the edges of my leaves with darker pigmented colors. So you can see I'm just kind of dragging my brush over the top. I'm trying not to move my fern leaves around, but inevitably things are going to shift and move, and that's okay. But my goal in this is letting some of that pigment seep into kind of the crevices, the nooks and crannies of some of my different leaves and foliage. I really want this interesting mix of color. I'm not really going for anything specific. I just like to kind of pick random interesting colors from my palette. I really love using unexpected colors with things from nature. So obviously you'd think maybe you'd be using greens or browns, things from nature, but I love using like hot pink and purple and blues just to play around with color and this process. And what I enjoy doing is playing around with this on our hot, dry days here in the summertime in the Pacific Northwest. Normally, if I work through a process like this, it would probably take overnight for things to dry and to really work with what I'm doing. But on a hot day, your surface is going to dry really quickly, which means as it dries, it will begin to soak up and leave an imprint of your foliage or those leaves. And so on a hot day, especially like we have over here, I have to actually work kind of quickly because I want to press things down while that surface is wet. And I want those leaves to somewhat stick to the watercolor pigment and that wet surface. The whole point of this again is pressing things down and letting them dry in that paint. And then we get to peel them off after things are dried, and you're left with an imprint, you're left with the edges showing, you're even left with some of that pigment soaking underneath things and leaving this really interesting impression of those leaves. While this process is really easy, incredibly fun, and it's perfect for all ages, it does take a little bit of trial and error and experimentation to figure out what works for you. Again, figuring out what leaves work best. For me personally, the thinner the leaves, the better they stick to my surface, and then figuring out what colors you like and how many leaves you want to put on that surface or how you want to arrange them. There are things that take a little bit of figuring out, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite easy, relaxing, and fun. And it's such a fun thing to do on a warm summer day because you're able to see results really quickly. Now, what I'm going to do is let you just simply watch me work through a couple of different surfaces with different leaves I've collected around our yard. I'm going to go for some different color combos on that surface, and then I'm going to lay things out in the sun and let them dry. And then once they are dry, I am simply going to peel all those leaves off of the surface, and you're going to get to see what we have left in their place. Again, this is a really fun way to make use of a warm summer day. Because a really wet watercolor surface takes a while to dry under normal circumstances, this is truly a fun way to make use of the heat or the warmth of a summer day. I actually ended up only needing to wait about 15 minutes for my surfaces to dry before I could peel off my leaves, and this was just a fun way to make the most of a hot day, of a heat wave over here, and knock out a bunch of these surfaces and have them dry really quickly. And there you have it, some really beautiful watercolor surfaces that you can use in a variety of different projects. I love adding these to my art journal. I love cutting up this type of paper, creating tags or cards with them. This is just a really fun way to not only make use of nature, but make use of maybe a warm day to knock out a bunch of really beautiful, interesting surfaces inspired by the world around you.